Hey guys, this is Dave with Audio In, and I have another sub $100 IEM, the Tanchjim 4U. Of course, they call it the 4U because it offers 4 different bass adjustments, giving you the ability to essentially tailor the sound to your personal preference. So as usual, we'll go over what's included in the package, talk about the specifications and design, and then we will do a sound breakdown. We have a lot to talk about, so let's get started. So this is everything that's included in the box. We have the IEMs and cable, a soft carrying pouch, some wide and narrow board tips, and a little flathead screwdriver for adjusting the bass dial. It's priced at $69, and it uses a single dynamic driver, which is housed in an all-metal shell. And on the inside of the shell, there's a little dial that gives you 4 different bass adjustments or bass levels to choose from: monitoring, natural, pop, and then atmosphere, which is the one I liked. The shell design is quite simple, however, it does look pretty clean. I do like the way they incorporated both the matte and the polished finishes on the faceplate design. And while the different finishes do add some character to the shells, my guess is the polished part may be prone to scratching, which I have experienced, and that's probably why it came with the protective plastic coating on the faceplate. That being said, I do feel like the build quality is good for the price because it does feel fairly robust, and my guess is it should hold up fine with regular use, again, aside from the scratching. It also has just a little bit of weight to it. However, because of its smaller build, I've found the fit to be quite comfortable, and it's still light enough as to not feel like it's weighing my ears down. So I didn't have any issues with discomfort, and I was also able to achieve a pretty good seal with the included large tips, the narrow bore tips, and maintain a secure, stable fit as well. The cable is pretty decent as well. It has a 3.5 termination and 2-pin connectors at the earpiece. It is a little thin, and it does feel maybe a little fragile, but it is soft and it's easy to manage, which is not super common actually at this price point. So that's nice. I can definitely appreciate that. All in all, though, the package is pretty nice. It's about what you might expect at this price point. Okay, let's move on to the sound. So the bass dial gives you basically 4 different signatures to choose from, each having different levels of bass energy. And it does ever so slightly affect the lowest parts of the mids as well. The first position is called monitoring, and this position gives you the least amount of bass. And it has what is essentially a cold, neutral, and maybe even what could be considered a brighter presentation. And this was my least favorite of the 4 because it was just simply way too lean in its bass presentation. And it also has a pretty substantial amount of sub bass roll off too. Second position is called natural, and it sounds basically identical to monitoring, but it adds anywhere between 2 to 3 dBs of mid bass and bass, and then roughly about 4 to 6 dBs of sub bass. So it does have more sub bass, but it is still quite rolled off. Then There is position 3, which is the pop signature, and this also sounds identical to the monitoring and natural signature, at least in the upper part of the tuning, the mids and the treble, but it adds even more bass. And this one actually isn't so bad as far as bass and mid-bass levels, but unfortunately this signature also has some sub-bass roll-off. So it does give you a little more punch, but it still lacks in terms of sub-bass rumble. And then finally we have the 4th position, which is called atmosphere. And this position has the most bass energy of the 4, but the rest of the tuning, the mid-range and treble tuning, is basically identical to the other 3 positions. And like I said, there are some very minor differences in the lower mids and maybe the higher mid-bass between about 2 to 300 hertz. And it is noticeable, especially when you compare the monitoring signature to the atmosphere position, because those positions have the most variance between them. And that variance is enough to swing it all the way from sounding, again, quite cold and somewhat bright, and that would be the monitoring signature, to sounding warm, which is the atmosphere signature. And the atmosphere signature is my favorite of the 4, and that was the position I did most of my listening in. And while I'm sure there probably will be those of you who may find one of the other 4 positions more to your liking, unfortunately I just don't have time to talk in detail about all 4 of them. So I'm gonna mainly focus on the position that I felt sounded the most balanced and was the closest to my personal preference. Other than to say the first 3 positions, monitoring, natural, and pop, had the most mid and treble forwardness, and again, sounded the leanest in their presentations. And that extra mid and treble energy did give me a little more vocal clarity, and it presented a slightly more open presentation. The bass levels just weren't quite there for me. And again, all 3 of those also had some pretty noticeable roll off in the sub bass. And position 4, atmosphere mode, seemed to bring it a little closer to my preference. But even in this mode, I would still consider its presentation to be a little lean sounding. So in position 4, or atmosphere mode, which is with the arrow facing in towards the nozzle, again, its presentation is what I would consider to be balanced, but with some warmth. But to break it down a little further, starting with the bass, this is the only mode that I feel actually has decent sub bass extension. So this gives you not a lot, but enough sub bass rumble and a really nice amount of bass presence overall. And because of that extra bass presence, it's also the most balanced of the 4 different signatures. And again, even in this mode, I would not consider this a bassy IEM at all. And it's also pretty punchy and dynamic as well. One area it does lack a little is in speed and texture. Not that it sounds pillowy necessarily, it just sounds like a decent budget dynamic driver bass. Now, as far as the mid-range, I did notice a little bass bleed, and while I would consider the overall mid-range presentation to be quite clean and mostly natural, there was still something about it that was kind of throwing me off just a little bit, and I'll talk more about that when we get into comparisons. Now, as far as vocal and instrument energy, that all felt pretty good to me. It seemed to strike a pretty nice balance between keeping the vocals front and center, but without sounding shouty or overly forward. And for the most part, the upper mids sounded pretty clean and adequately detailed. And then as you move into the treble, generally I think they did a good job with the treble as far as the overall treble energy and its overall naturalness. However, it does come across sounding a little dark for me personally. So it's going to be a fairly non-fatiguing set for those who might be more treble sensitive. Interestingly though, it does have some upper treble energy that does help bring just a small amount of micro detail back into the picture. And it also brings out some air, not a lot, but some. So generally I do think its overall presentation, its treble presentation, works pretty well with the rest of the tuning in atmosphere mode. And again, while I do think the upper treble presence helps a little with detail, I do feel like it could have used just a tad more energy to kind of help with some of that darkness I was picking up on. Now, as far as technical performance, it did seem to be about on par with much of the competition, which is good. Detail levels are adequate, not necessarily anything that stands out at this price range, but still good enough. Soundstage is about average width. I wouldn't call it narrow, but I would say the forward depth is maybe a little more on the intimate side. Imaging is also okay. Its positional cues are obvious enough to be able to place instruments properly within the sound field. But generally speaking, I have no complaints about its technical performance for this price range. Now, moving on to comparisons, I will tell you right now, while I wouldn't necessarily have thought this set sounded unnatural in isolation, when I started to do my comparisons, I did feel like the Delsey and Aria 2 presented vocals and instruments just a little more natural. And I also think their treble presentation had just as much detail as the 4U, but actually sounded just a little smoother and a little more natural as well. Now, as far as technical performance, the 4U is basically on par with the Delsey and Aria 2. Now, I do prefer the 4U's overall tuning slightly over the EA500LM, but the EA500LM is going to give you a little better technical performance. So I guess what it comes down to, really, in the end, is personal preference. And for me, personally, I prefer the Aria 2 and Delsey over the 4U, but I prefer the 4U over the EA500LM. But honestly, again, in isolation, I don't even know if those differences between the Aria 2 and Delsey are significant enough to not give the 4U a recommendation, because it's still a really nice sounding IEM. And I know I've said this several times in my last few budget IEM reviews, but I think it bears repeating. It's very rare to find a budget set without issues, some of which are subjective anyway. So at this price point, a lot of the things I bring up are really just nitpicks, because these are entry-level IEMs, and in many cases, you're just trading off one attribute or deficiency for another. But the bottom line is the 4U is a very solid IEM for $69. And while I'm not going to give it a strong recommendation, I do think it does deserve a recommendation, because while it's not the most natural sounding, it's still natural sounding enough to enjoy, and there isn't anything about it that I would consider a distraction. Again, in atmosphere mode, it has impactful bass, clean mids, its technical performance is basically on par with the competition, with the exception of the EA500LM, and it's generally just a pleasing IEM to listen to. So it's not the best, but it is still very good. So that concludes my review of the Tanchjim 4U. Thanks so much for taking the time to watch. If you like my content, please take a second and hit that subscribe button. Also, if you would please like this video, please share this video. I hope you guys have an awesome day.